Well, for some of you who may not know me, or if you're watching online, my name is Absher, and I'm the Communication and Creative Arts Pastor here at Grace. And anytime I find myself in this position, and Pastor Chip is not in this position, I like to explain why, just so that we're all on the same page. So many of you know we've been going through our Bold sermon series, and I don't know about you, has anybody enjoyed the Bold sermon series? Hasn't it been awesome? I think it's been incredible, and Pastor Chip does this every year, kind of bringing us back into focus about who we are as a church, why we do the things that we do, and about being more bold and more passionate and more excited about being the intentional neighbors God has called us to be. But in sort of while we're waiting on that, I'm here, you're here, we might as well get started. That was very nice, whoever started that. $20 in the lobby afterward, no problem. So I want to get started just by telling you a story, and it's sort of a story that, you know, it's sort of emotional in a sense, but I just want to tell you this story. There was a man by the name of Bryant Womack, and he was a medic in the army in Korea, and there's this really incredible story about him where he was with a troop of soldiers who were patrolling at night. He was the only medic with them. And during the night, they came under fire from some enemy troops, and they were pinned down. And of course, immediately people were wounded. And being the only medic with the group, he did exactly what he should have done, which he rushed in. And though he was exposing himself to danger and to enemy fire, he did what he had to do to tend to the wounded. And he would continue to do this even though he was in great danger. And as he was doing this, he was actually struck by mortar fire, and he totally lost his right arm. And being an army medic, you can imagine he knew the severity of that injury. He knew that really he needed to go immediately, have medical attention if he even stood a chance to survive. But being the sort of this brave, courageous man and knowing he was the only medic with them, he chose to stay on the battlefield. And because he had lost his arm, he couldn't even do the things a medic would do. He was giving other soldiers instructions about how to care for those who were wounded. And they continued to do this, and over a period of time, he eventually was the absolute last person to retreat from the battlefield, and he collapsed on that battlefield because of loss of blood. He gave up his life in order to bring healing to these other soldiers' lives. And maybe when you hear a story like that, and when I hear a story like that, we think of, man, what an incredible man that must have been, someone who was so passionate about doing what he believed his duty to be, about giving up his life for the life of others. And if you're like me, I would love to meet that guy. I'd love to ask him some questions about how can you be that kind of person? And so what we're going to do this weekend is talk about another person that you probably know of named Jesus, who was a lot like this army medic who was wounded, but it was all for the sake of healing other people. And so to give you an overview of what we're going to do this weekend, we're going to start at the end of the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to talk about where Jesus is before the Roman soldiers, and they're going to mock him, they're going to beat him, they're going to spit on him, and he is going to suffer. And sometimes we read quickly through that part of the Bible because, you know, maybe we don't want to think about how gruesome that must have been, but we're going to start there in the suffering of Jesus. And then we're going to go back through the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to look at the healing stories of times that Jesus healed people. And what we're going to see is this really awesome thing that Mark does, where every place that Jesus was wounded, we'll see in the Gospel of Mark that it actually brought healing to somebody else. And then at the end, we're going to talk about what does this mean for all of us here this weekend? What should we take home from this? So we're going to get started by jumping in at the end of the Gospel of Mark. In chapter 15, it says, and the soldiers led him, Jesus, away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters, and they called together the whole battalion. Now, if you're like me, I kind of have mental images when I read these stories of what's going on, and I kind of thought maybe Jesus was in a more private place, and there were 10 or 12, maybe 20 soldiers who were going to do all these terrible things to Jesus. But actually, the whole battalion was called together. And in a Roman battalion was between 400 and 500 soldiers. So to sort of give you perspective, if we were maybe to take everyone in this room right now, that would roughly be a Roman battalion. So what's about to happen to Jesus is by no means this sort of private, sort of in the back room of the palace. It is public, it's out there, and it's by 400 to 500 soldiers that are going to do what they're about to do to Jesus. And so let's just see what's about to happen. They clothed him in a purple cloak because kings would have worn purple, and twisting together a crown of thorns to mock him because kings would have worn crowns, they put it on Jesus. And then they began to salute him, "Hail, King of the Jews." And they were striking his head with a reed, and they would have hit him with a reed because every king would have a scepter. And so they were mocking him. "This is your scepter. You have no kingdom. You have no power. You have no authority." They were striking his head with a reed, and they were spitting on him, and they were kneeling down in homage to him. And so you've got to imagine this scene with me, that we've got between 400 and 500 Roman soldiers who think they're so powerful, mocking the one that really is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, but they don't realize it, and they're striking him. How many of the 500 might have struck Jesus? How many of the 500 might have spit upon him? How many of the 500 were kneeling down and mocking him? It's this, when we really think about it, it's this terrible, awful scene. And then it doesn't really get better, but I just want to draw your attention to 3 things that are happening to Jesus before he's crucified. They're striking his head, they're spitting on him, and they're kneeling down, paying homage to him, mocking him. These are 3 ways that these soldiers were trying to wound and embarrass and shame Jesus. And then it doesn't get better. Once they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak, put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. And so the hands of Jesus would be immobilized on the cross for your sins and for my sins. And it's this really, really hard thing sometimes for us to really remember what our Savior had done on our behalf, to think through the ways that he was wounded. But thankfully, and maybe you're all feeling this way, thankfully that's not really the point of the message. Is just to remember the sufferings of Jesus, though I think it's good for us to do that. Now what we're going to do is go back through the Gospel of Mark and look at the ways that Jesus healed people. And what we're going to see is that all these ways that Jesus was wounded are the exact ways that he brought healing to other people in the gospel. And I believe to you and to me and to all of us here this weekend. So the first thing that the soldiers did is they were striking Jesus' head, right? They're stretching out their hands in order to harm him. They're stretching out their hands against him in order to draw blood. But look what happens when other people in the Gospel of Mark, when they stretch out their hand to Jesus, they're healed. So watch what happens. The first story is the healing of a man with a withered hand. It's super short. It goes like this. Again, Jesus entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored immediately. What about the second story that you may be familiar with, the healing of the woman with the issue of blood? She's going to stretch out her hand to Jesus. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and she came up behind him in the crowd, and she touched his garment. She stretched out her hand just to touch Jesus. And we find out that it was going to be effective, but she just said, "If I just even touch his garments, I'll be made well." And immediately, Mark loves the word immediately. Immediately, the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. So when these Roman soldiers, when they stretch out their hands to Jesus, they're trying to draw blood, they're trying to hurt, they're trying to inflict pain. But when these people stretch out their hands to Jesus, because of his woundings, he brings healing to them because he's the wounded healer. What about the second thing that the Roman guards are doing to Jesus? They're spitting on him. Now there's a lot of things in the New Testament that we don't really naturally understand, right? There's cultural things that we have to sort of get a grip on, but we all understand that spitting on someone is not a good thing. You're in big trouble if you do that, and if you were to do that to someone, it'd be your way of saying, "You are meaningless to me, you're below, you're subhuman, I don't care about you." So we understand this, that when the Roman guards, maybe even 500 of them, spit on Jesus, they're mocking him, they're ridiculing him, they're saying, "You are nothing to us." But what's going to happen when Jesus, believe it or not, he spits on a person in the Gospel of Mark? In chapter 8, we get this really odd story. And Jesus and the disciples, came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man. And they begged Jesus to touch this blind man. Jesus, we know who you are. We've seen what you can do. We've got this blind man here. We really need you to touch him and to heal him. We know you can do it. And so they begged Jesus to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And watch this. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? Now, let's be real. If you've read this story, we got to skip this part. Like, what is going on? That doesn't make any sense. That's not a good look, Jesus. You can't go around spitting on people. What is happening? I know you've had those thoughts when you read this story. I've had them. What's going on here? Why is Jesus spitting on this man? But he does. And then he asks, do you see anything? And the man says, he looked up and he said, I see people, but they look like trees walking. It's blurry. Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. What's the point of this story? Mark's trying to show us that in the same way that these Roman guards would spit upon Jesus, because he was wounded in that way, he would spit upon a blind man, and that blind man would be able to see. It's this really beautiful thing Mark's doing, that Jesus really is the wounded healer. And it's important to note in this story, maybe you're asking the question, I know I have when I've read it, why did Jesus have to do this twice? Because it kind of seems, if we're just being honest, it kind of seems like Jesus tried to heal him and then it didn't work and then Jesus had to do it again. But we learn all through the Gospels, Jesus just touches a person, boom, healed. Jesus says, be clean, boom, clean. Jesus has his garment touched, boom, healed. So why did Jesus do this twice? Just a little Bible study note for you. If you read the passage that comes before this and the passage that comes right after it, this healing of a blind man is actually also a lesson to the disciples about their own spiritual blindness, that they don't fully see and that they need another touch from Jesus and another parable and another saying and another teaching and more prayer in order to be able to see clearly. So Jesus not only heals this blind man, but he also teaches his disciples a lesson about their own spiritual insights. So now to the third thing that these Roman guards do to Jesus. They kneel down in homage to him. If we were to move all the chairs out of this room and all of us were to gather together and kneel down and make fun of whoever was on stage, please don't do that. That would be kind of the scene, that Jesus is being mocked and ridiculed. And in a culture where honor and shame are so important, this would have been such a terrible thing to do to Jesus. But they're kneeling down in homage to him. But watch what happens every time somebody else in the Gospel of Mark kneels down to Jesus. Not to mock him, they end up being healed. We got two stories. Number one is the healing of a leper. And to kind of set up this story, you have to know what it would be like to be a leper in the first century. It was bad news. It was terrible. According to the law in Leviticus, you were confined to be outside the camp for as long as you were unclean. And every time you came into town or you were around people, you had to scream out, unclean, unclean. I'm sick. Get away from me. Step back. Can you imagine the isolation that a person with leprosy would feel living their whole lives alone, having no chance to have human interaction or community in any way? That was the life of a leper. And this man comes to Jesus, and watch what happens. A leper came to him and imploring him and kneeling said to him, if you will, you can make me clean. Now, this leper had no business being this close to Jesus. He should have been screaming, unclean, unclean. Not only is Jesus a Jewish man, but he also is a rabbi. And so he would have known the law. This man had no business being this close to Jesus, but he comes up, he's desperate for healing in his life. And so he kneels before Jesus. If you will, you can make me clean. And moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will be clean. And then we learn immediately, there's that word again, immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. So as these Roman soldiers kneel and they mock Jesus, I wonder, did Jesus remember this leper who knelt before him and he was healed. Or what about this second story of healing, the healing of a little girl? We learn in Mark chapter 5, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue. In our last story of a man who knelt before Jesus, he was a nobody. He was a leper. Nobody cared what he thought or said or did. He was the bottom of the barrel of society. But now we've got a ruler of the synagogue who is coming to Jesus. This is a man with some reputation. This is a man with some authority, with some power, a guy who sort of has some stuff going on in his life. It's looking pretty good, but he comes to Jesus too, Jairus by name, and seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet. Probably didn't look so good for Jairus, probably a little embarrassing, but he didn't care. He was desperate. And so he kneels at the feet of Jesus. And then he implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live. And then we find out that the servants of Jairus come to his house or come to him and say, don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter has already died. He can't do anything now. And Jesus says, hold on. I can do something. I'm coming, just believe. And so they go to Jairus' house, and everybody is in mourning over this little girl's life, and Jesus sort of cuts through that, goes straight to the girl. And then we learn that taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And it's no accident that that word arise is there all through the New Testament, especially the Gospels. You'll see that exact same word in Greek used to refer to Jesus' resurrection. Why? Because Mark's trying to tell us, because Jesus was resurrected, this little girl can be resurrected. And it's this really beautiful thing. And then immediately, the girl got up and she began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And so what I hope you can see so far as we've gone through Mark, it's this really incredible thing that all the wounds of Jesus, Roman soldiers stretching out their hands to strike him and to draw blood, when people in the Gospel of Mark stretch out their hand to Jesus, the woman has her blood flow dry up and she's healed. And Jesus, as these guards, they spit on him in mocking. When he spits on a blind man, the blind man can see. And Jesus, when they kneel down before him, 500 Roman guards, and they mock him, when other people in the gospel kneel before Jesus, they're healed. Because all the ways that Jesus was wounded was meant to bring healing. And I'm just crazy enough to believe, maybe I am crazy, that the same Jesus who was wounded for the healing of these people in the gospel, that same Jesus was wounded for your healing and for my healing. I don't think it was a 2,000 year ago thing. Okay, I'm not crazy. You seem to agree. But I really do believe that this Jesus who was wounded for the healing of those people in the gospel, he was wounded to heal us. And maybe that's a physical healing, maybe that's spiritual or emotional, maybe it's a healing in your marriage or in your family, but I'm just crazy enough to believe that Jesus endured what he did to bring healing into our lives. And so we're going to talk about, what does this mean for us? I want to give you just 4 things that I think these stories, as we read the Gospel of Mark and we see what Jesus did, 4 things that I think this means for all of us. Number 1 is this: a healing from Jesus, whether for ourselves or for someone else, takes us out of our comfort zone. If we want healing in our lives, it's gonna take us out of our comfort zone. Maybe you have something going on in your marriage that's broken. You can't be comfortable and get it fixed at the same time. And we learn that from this healing story. Remember, Jesus had a blind man and he took the blind man out of the village. Why does that matter? Because in the village, the blind man was comfortable. In the village, there's such a strong sense in first century culture in Israel that you cared for the wounded, you cared for the sick. This man was probably laid or put by a rich person's house. They would have fed him, they would have clothed him. He probably knew the voices of people in town, so he knew if I needed to go to this person's house, oh, I hear that person, they'll take me there. Maybe the blind man even knew the village so well that he knew if I just walk this many steps this way and then turn and go this many steps that way. I'll end up here. The blind man knew what he was doing in the village, but Jesus, to heal him, Jesus takes the blind man out of the village. And outside the village, the blind man has no point of reference. Outside the village, the only thing that the blind man has to hold on to are the hands of Jesus. That's it. That's what we have to trust in. If we want healing, it's gonna be uncomfortable, but I promise Jesus will be there. Jesus is the one who can lead us through it. And if we're in his hands, we're just in the best place we could ever be. But to have healing in our lives, whether it be emotionally or in your family or whatever it is, it's gonna be a little uncomfortable, and that's okay. The second thing, when you're wounded and then healed, your scars become your testimony. That's just, amen, I agree. That's so true. And I think if we were to, so many of us could raise our hand right now probably and stand up and say, I was here, now I'm here. The only thing that's different is Jesus was in there somewhere. That's just how it is. And we learn that from these stories. Look how incredible this is. Remember the man with the leprosy, okay? Remember what we talked about, that this leper, every time he went into town, would have to cry out, unclean, unclean. I'm coming and I'm sick and you need to move away. So the people in this town, they knew, as soon as they heard his voice, they knew what he was gonna say. They knew he was just gonna say, I'm still sick. How many years had he come into town and said the exact same thing? Unclean, unclean, back away. But then watch what happens when the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Watch what this leper does. He went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news, and so that Jesus could no longer enter a town openly. Isn't that amazing? Literally one guy who always came into town with two words to say, unclean, unclean. Now one thing has changed in his life. He's been healed because he's met Jesus. And now he comes into town and he starts talking freely and he starts spreading the word. And this one guy makes Jesus so famous that Jesus can't even get into a town anymore because everybody wants to get close to him. They want to know this guy. And when I read a story like that, I think to myself, what makes us any different than the leper? We've had our things in our life where Jesus has brought healing, and all of a sudden we're different. And what if, I'm just gonna give you a rhetorical question, what if all of us were to take the places where we were broken and we were wounded and then Jesus healed, and if we were to talk about it openly and spread the word, next weekend, would this building be able to hold everybody who would come to hear about Jesus? I don't think so. I'm just crazy enough to think that that's just how it is, that if we would talk freely and spread the word next weekend or any weekend after that, I wonder would the doors of this, like we'd have to take them off and have people spread out into the parking lot because they just want to hear about what Jesus has done in my life and in your life. It's because those places when we're wounded and then healed, our scars, they become our testimony. And it's our job to share it with the world. It's not ours. It's really the good news. And the world needs to hear the good news. Number 3, Jesus wants to come near to you before you're well. Jesus wants to come near to you before you're well. And here, I'm just gonna pause for a moment. I'm just gonna be real with you about how I am as a person. I am a hardcore perfectionist in like every area of my life. And that makes me uncomfortable with a few things. I hate being wrong. My wife will tell you, I hate it. I don't like feeling weak and like I don't have it all together. I don't like feeling like I need help. I don't like any of those things. That's just me being honest. And I found that can bleed over into my spiritual life, where if there's an area of my life that's broken into 10 pieces, I feel like I've got to put 9 of them back together myself, and then I can go to Jesus with it. That's how I feel. Because I feel like I got to just be a little bit better before I actually pray about this. And maybe some of you are that way. There's things in your life you've never dared to open your mouth to say a word or pray a prayer because you think, I've got to get it together more first. But I'm here to tell you 100% that is not the way it works. And here's how I know that. It's from the story that we read. Remember the leper that Jesus was moved with pity, and he stretched out his hand and he touched him. Why is that important? It's because the man isn't healed of leprosy until the next verse. Jesus didn't walk 100 yards away and scream over, be clean. No, while this man was still as sick as he had ever been in his life, Jesus walked over and got close and touched this man. That's who Jesus is. When we're broken and when we're hurting and when we don't have it all together, Jesus still wants to be close, just like he was for this leper. He wants to be close to you. And we say it at Grace all the time. Everybody's invited and all are welcome. You don't have to have it all together to come to Jesus. This man certainly didn't. But Jesus wants to be close even before we're well. And fourth, final thing, but this is the one I'm most excited about, is this. We should work with desperation to bring Jesus' healing to the world. With absolute knockdown, drag out abandonment, we should be working to bring Jesus' healing to the world. Our mission at Grace is to reach the unchurched by being intentional neighbors that reflect Christ. Because Christ has saved me, I can reflect that and say, Jesus wants to save you too. Because Christ was wounded and I'm healed, Jesus wants to heal you too. It's our job with desperation to bring Jesus' healing to the world. And here's how I know that. It's another one of the stories that we read. The blind man in Mark 8, that when Jesus and the disciples came to Bethsaida, some people brought to him a blind man, and these people begged Jesus to touch him. Why is that so significant? Do you notice in the story, the blind man, the one who's in darkness, the one who needs the healing, he doesn't even ask for it. It took other people who knew who Jesus was to grab this man and drag him to Jesus and beg Jesus to heal him. And I'm telling you, that's who we have to be. There is a whole world that's out there. They're blind. They don't even know that Jesus is close. This blind man didn't even seem to know who Jesus was, that he could do something in his life. It took other people to grab this blind man and pull him to Jesus and beg him to touch him. And then, of course, Jesus does. But that's our job to, with absolute desperation, grab people, not just invite people. You hear Pastor Chip say it all the time. Don't be an inviter, be a bringer. Actually, to bring people who are lost, who are hurting, who are broken, and who are blind to meet the one who was wounded so that they could be healed. That's our mission. That's what we're supposed to be doing. And we started by talking about the Army medic, Bryant Womack. And we said, it'd be pretty cool to meet a person like that who cares so much for others, he would lay down his own life, who would be wounded trying to heal others. Well, if you're here this weekend or if you're watching online and you know Jesus, you've already met the wounded healer. And if you're here this weekend and you don't know Jesus, I want to invite you, as we're going to sing a final song, to come and meet the person who was wounded so that you could be made whole. And as we sing this last song, I'm going to ask you to do something. You don't have to do it, but I'm just going to ask us that as we sing this last song, if we know that Jesus was wounded to make us whole, and that wasn't just for a blind man, that wasn't just for the leper in Mark, it's for you. And it's for me. And don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying if you pray a prayer hard enough and read these stories 10 more times that all of a sudden everything in your life will be perfect. That's not what we're saying. But what I am saying is the same Jesus, and I just believe this with all of my heart, the same Jesus who was wounded in order to heal these people in the Gospel of Mark, he is the same Jesus who was wounded to heal all of us. And so I'm going to ask you in this last song, I'm just going to ask you, maybe now's the time to pray a bold prayer. Maybe now's the time to think about that situation in your family and how you can get involved and share the healing of Jesus in that place, or something that's going on with you physically that you want to pray and ask Jesus and kneel down at his feet just like Jairus did and just like the leper did and ask him to heal you. Now, I'm not promising that those things will necessarily happen, but what I do know is the heart of Jesus is to bring healing and wholeness to his people. And so I'm going to pray bold prayers because I just think that's who Jesus is. So would you pray with me? God, we love you.